In this part, we're going to zoom in a little bit to do some detailing or start detailing and defining the smaller medium shapes. Now we've had the plugin, we have the rough paint. It's time to go through and fix some things up, add a bit more detail. In the beginning, I'm taking an overall look, seeing if anything really pops out, if kind of the plugin makes sense, and if I'm able to work from this point. A good idea to create a new layer just to keep things a little bit organized. I don't want all of my painting to be on a single layer. Take it as a giving yourself that option to always go back to a more simple painterly texture. And now that I'm looking at it, it might be nice to have a sort of a setup of imagine you zooming out from the mesh and it would fade into your simplified texture. Unrelated to this, so let's paint. But what I'm trying to say is that just there's always so many things to explore. So obviously my brush got much smaller, and I'll start adding a bit of highlights and around the dark edges here. I'm changing my brush size in two ways. You can either control right click, but then that, like, if you control right click and move left to right, that changes the brush size. But if you control right click and move up and down, that changes the hardness of the brush. So sometimes it's a bit easy to change the hardness without wanting to do that. Excuse me. But then, just like in Photoshop, you can change the brush size with the bracket keys. Well, I'm not doing that here. Not really, but a good way to think about it when you're approaching this is how are you treating the brush strokes depending on what kind of material it is. Let's say if I had a few more cubes here and one was wood and another one was metal, how would I treat those textures differently than how I'm doing when I'm painting these? And that's going to be part of your stylistic choices, which can be, just come from the brushes you use or, of course, the way you apply them. Good exercise to do is to just try and stick to a single brush, which is what I'm doing here. It kind of limits you and makes you think a bit about how you are using the brush, because you might want to achieve certain results and you are committed to just having, well, sort of a single look, at least with the brush. Usually in, say, productions, you'll have a certain brush set that you're using, with every single brush having a dedicated task for it. So there's not a lot of kind of guessing games. That's how you keep all the art in a big project, looking like the same style. So that's something you can try and do, in personal pieces as well, to have those clear definitions of when and how are you using different brushes. Now when it comes to just painting this, you see me kind of going all around, and I'm working on top of the generated dark lines. So I'm just kind of adding a little bit of highlights on top of them. I am treating this as if it was kind of lit from the top, mostly, because that is, the natural look of objects. That's how we're used to seeing things. The light is coming from the top, so that's kind of how I'm approaching this. you don't just want to go in all kind of blind and add random details. It still has to have a, not, meaning, but a bit of a thought behind it. So after the initial block-in with the procedural masks and everything, the approach is kind of the same. I'm just painting it. I'm treating it as if it was a painting, really. And with that comes sort of different stages, as you would have in a painting. I will start with the more of the dark areas and slowly start building up the light. Keep the brush big in the beginning and then go smaller and smaller. Now, looking back at this, I can't help but also wonder if there was, a better approach for this, say, specific piece. And I believe I could have just textured a very simple kind of cube rectangle and then add all this wonkiness later. Because if I did, then I could have a perfect mirroring and then just work, on possibly just two sides of it. Have the other two sides the same. You never see it from both sides anyway. So that would have saved me working, on all four sides one by one, and then just save a lot of time overall. Because the 3D model of it is so simple, it really wouldn't hurt it if you adjust it that little bit after. But yeah, as you can see, sometimes the better solutions come to you way after you've done with it, or perhaps just sit down and think what is the best approach, how can you save time doing it. Again, I mean, for this I didn't care too much what is the best kind of a pipeline thing, because it's just a fun little prop. But if I was to make a bunch of these, then I'd start kind of going into it and seeing if I'm doing anything that's too repetitive, too often. Can something be automated? Can something be done differently to help out and not spend like way too many hours? I think just personally, I have a bit of a tendency to, in my personal work, do a lot of extra work that doesn't really get, seen in the end. So that's on me. End of the day, personal work is to enjoy stuff and, not think about the realities of production. So you see me going through all different sides of the mesh, all four of them, to paint all the unique details everywhere, which is, a bit of an overkill. Though you do get a nice, you could call it a key prop in the end. If I do a 360 turnaround of it, you're not gonna see a repeated detail in there. The whole thing took around 2 hours, so I feel that's quite okay. I could have maybe shaved off probably a good half an hour if I mirrored the different sides and approached the 3D model a bit differently. But end of the day, you know, I'm not too worried about that in this case. As long as, of course, it doesn't get too long and boring for you guys to watch. But I really wanted to keep this one real time because I've watched a lot of tutorials myself, and a lot of them were sped up, which I usually don't mind, but I found that speed that you see, sped up tutorials just move the brush, starting to influence the way I'm putting down strokes. I would try almost to match that speed that I've seen countless tutorials in, and I just felt it's really kind of messing with the way I work. So I want to keep this in real time. You just see exactly how my brush moves and what is kind of the speed and how long it takes to get to a certain result. But of course, feel free to put up the speed to maybe 1.5 or something, just so it doesn't start feeling too long, because it is mostly just painting, and I think you'll still be able to understand what I'm saying. As I'm going through this, you'll notice that I'm kind of naming my layers straight away. That's just not just to keep it clean, it's also to sort of set the next stage for myself of what is it that I'm working on. So obviously I start with a procedural block in, then I have the very, very rough paint over, add any necessary details. I mean, this is, not set in stone. This is as it sort of comes along, that's not a step that's in one place or the other. If you have to, you have to. It's like it's all fine. But when it comes to just the painting part, so on top of the block-in, I'll do the very, very rough painting. Then I'll add a bit more paint. It's still loose. I'm not trying to blend in any colors or values or anything, but it's still loose, but I'm adding more details. So you could say in the second stage, the brush just becomes a bit smaller overall. Then later on, we'll be adding even more details, move into working on the surface, getting rid of some of the hard strokes, blending areas where they need to be blended, sort of a sharp versus soft, edges when it comes to painting, and then adding the final bits of details. So I try to have a path, or an approach in mind. It's not just so I also know when I'm moving on to the next step. What is it I'm doing very clearly, instead of sort of just jumping around too much. I'm not gonna have a super detailed area in one part of the mesh or one part of the texture and completely loose in the other. It kinda all comes together as a whole. It's kind of interesting to me why I haven't seen Substance Painter being used for all this kind of stuff, because I do feel it does a very good job, especially with its connection to Photoshop and its brushes. It's usually 3D Coat, or I've even seen Blender. But yeah, at this point, Substance Painter is very nice for this kind of stuff, just with the procedural nature and, well, the brushes that were mentioned before. It does a pretty good job. I don't feel like the tool is limiting me in any way. At the end of the day, it is just a tool. So whatever works better for you is still, the best thing then. In other cases, I would jump around between Substance Painter and Photoshop for the painting, because still just out of the comfort level in Photoshop is higher, and there's still certain few smudge blending brushes in there that I really enjoy. I just can control my strokes a little bit better, but yeah, Painter can get me pretty far. That's a really nice detail being added now. I think that sort of gives the prop some character. This little bend in the plane is the kind of the areas that you want to look for, where you can add some sort of tiny little element like that. Just adds a bit of interest in that whole blank space. What I could have done a bit better on this piece is, well, just while working on it, is to just zoom out more often to see it as a whole. I get a bit tunnel visioned, I can tell, just working on parts of it, and I'm not seeing how it reads from a further distance. But then again, I also don't have any scene that this will go into. It just as is sort of thing. So I don't know how much that matters. It's just so you're not overworking, not fiddling too much in the unnecessary details. So let's see kind of what I'm thinking about, what I'm trying to do here when painting these. I'm obviously working around the procedural details that I've added, and then the kind of stylization painterly part that I'm trying to keep are the curvatures on the side. So you can see the brighter bits on the edges. I'm trying to keep that. I'm imagining that it is being lit from the top, even though I'm adding a bit of form shape variations to the sides as well, just so it reads more 3D. How much of it you want to do is a question for what your end shader is going to be. If you're going to have a properly lit shader with shadows, you might want to keep those sides fairly close in value and not exaggerate too much. But otherwise, it's kind of very open to interpretation. That is the fun bit that I find, is to kind of where you limit yourself and what the final might be. I can imagine this, not even having a shader as much, in the end, put it in a scene, bake some ambient occlusion on top of the whole thing, or add some cell shading in the end. It's just, yeah, it just depends. And when is the point where you have to have this answer when painting this? Well, probably the sooner the better. My idea for this was some very flat shading, so I would have like very sharp shadows and very sharp lights. So yeah, imagine cell shading on top of this. And the way then it will work with the textures is if we were painting it, again, imagine that my colors are gonna be some overlay or color dodge in the light areas, and then whatever is in shadow is going to be a single color that is multiplied or overlaid as well with a dark color on top of it. So the shader would be contributing as well to the stylized, painterly nature of this. These are the kind of limitations that I have in my head when working on personal works like this, just to kind of ground myself a little bit. Not that I won't change my mind and do completely something different, but yeah, I think it's good to know where you're kind of headed, but it's also good to just explore. I mean, basically, it's a personal piece. Just do what you want, you know. There's no art police. Coming back to the painting of the textures themselves, what I'm working through mainly now is just the transition areas between, the top planes and side planes, and then the different materials within it, that kind of the fatty bit and the meat bit, how those transition into each other, what kind of textury surface definition there is. I keep looking back at my reference material. I see that there's a bit of sort of, I don't know, weird texture. So I'm trying to add a bit of a definition of that. Starting to also just blend out some of the most roughest areas with just a big brush. Some places can become a bit too contrasty and with a too small of a brush, so I might just take a big one, sample a color, and just go over the whole piece to bring the tones together. And right now here you see that's the kind of stuff I'm working on. I don't want this super soft edge to be where there should be a clear definition between those different materials. I'm kind of quickly checking around what I've done on some other sides, if I've already started touching these up, and how I approach that, and just applying it to the other ones. And it can be as loose as this. It's it is completely fine. It is still doing what I want it to do, it being a much harder edge and not a kind of soft brushed, airbrushed look, because that's what's standing out at this point. That kind of looks off because it doesn't read correctly, but it is just a couple of brush strokes away for it to look fine. In a moment I'll accidentally make my brush a bit too soft. Again, with the control right clicking, you can either increase the size of the brush or the softness of it, and it takes a little bit for me to realize it. But I'm also working on blending in the colors so it doesn't stand out too much. This is when I was working on this. This is around the point where I realized I am doing too much of repetitive work. But at that point, I still didn't think about just bringing in a very simple cube and then shaping it into something a bit more organic like this after painting the textures. So I'm really not using all the tools that are available for me, and I'm redoing a lot of work. And that's totally fine. It's all about practicing and learning, and if you keep doing it, you'll find better ways and faster approaches without sacrificing quality. I'm going around now and softening a lot of the edges, just blending them together by picking the color that's kind of close to it and just painting over, lightly touching it so it's not full opacity. Other way to do it is obviously using a smudge brush, but I haven't played around with smudge brushes enough in Substance Painter to be comfortable with using them. But they do a fairly okay job as well, and you could even get a certain texture while blending. But I wanted to keep it with just color picking and blending with the same brush, just to keep it very basic. Personally, I easily get lost in all the ways and all the different approaches, so sometimes limiting myself with the tools that I use helps me to just progress with the work itself, think about that more instead of how am I gonna approach it. So if you're anything like that, try it out as well. Just give yourself one brush and try and do the whole thing with a single brush. Since painting this way is very much just pure painting, it's just happens to be on top of a 3D model, so a lot of the kind of painting techniques kind of go hand in hand here. And say a very popular way to practice painting with real paints is to limit yourself with the amount of colors you're using. So you'd use a limited palette. So that teaches you how to mix the colors to still get your desired result in all the different colors. So you don't have 20, 30 paints squeezed out on your palette. You just have 6 or just 4. So in the same way with digital, we can limit ourselves with the tools that we use just to familiarize ourselves with that tool better and focus more on the piece itself. If I had 100 brushes to always go through and find the right thing for the right job, that's a bit excessive. I don't want to spend half my time searching for the brush. I used to have hundreds of brushes that I used in Photoshop, and I would spend a half an hour searching for the right brushes because it has to be somewhere. I have so many of them. But limiting myself to up to 10 brushes or something, and not even using all of them when painting is I found a good way. You'll see here when I'm painting these sort of highlights, I'm trying to replicate the texture that I see in the reference. So I'm applying the brush strokes in a bit of a specific way, kind of a stroke dot dot, or trying to add some variation instead of just making it a one line, because this is I already know the kind of detail that's gonna stay there until the end. So when zoomed out, I want it to read kind of correctly. And then I'm trying to break up the shapes, make it a bit more interesting. So it's not just kind of horizontal lines going across all the time. Add a bit of variation that may not have come directly from the procedural textures when we began. It's important that I build this up slowly, same way as I was going from a big brush to a smaller brush. I will treat it the same with values. So I'm not going to paint my darkest darks or my lightest lights early on. That's going to be left as for the very end, just like in painting. So I'm conscious to leave room while I'm painting right now to keep the value scale kind of squeezed, so I can always have the brightest brights and the lightest lights. And even, probably not going to use the whole value scale for this. There's not going to be, complete blacks in the texture. It's going to stay more on the light side. In painting, it can be a good idea to separate things into stages, but certain kind of stuff I found a bit, I'm not sure, like it just didn't come naturally to me. For example, if you wanted to separate in a different stage the soft and sharp edges, so there's a technique where you would, paint it all with hard edges and then go around and smooth out the edges that you want to be soft, which is nice, because you take it one step at a time. You only need to think about one certain element at a time, because first you're just blocking in the correct and nice shapes, and then you can go and soften them. But I don't know, I just didn't, for me that just didn't feel too natural. So I'm trying, I have a kind of a stage where I'm just thinking more about it, if I want a soft or a hard edge, but I don't like how unnatural the painting might look when it's all kind of shape based. So it's very much down to your personal preferences as well. Now, is it weird to keep staring at a piece of pork for 2 hours? Yeah, I guess so. But I've seen people do material studies with kind of cubes, and then whatever material is painted on a cube. And I thought this kind of fits quite perfectly in 3D. When it comes to practice, it's nice to make it fun for yourself. It always should be fun. So just when I was talking about limiting your tools, uh, here I've limited myself to that hard round brush only, but I still want some texture. So you can see me trying to kind of create a textural pattern just by that, which in turn makes it kind of a bit more painterly and stylized. And I'm still getting across the textural feel. And you could keep adding layers and layers of details to make it really properly painted, but that's not what I'm going for here. Now, you'll see me doing a lot of color picking, so you can understand how important it is the base block in, because maybe I'm doing too much color picking here and I should add a bit of variation of color, or just leave it till the end, or ignore it kind of completely. But basically what I'm saying is your blocking is so important if you're gonna just do the color pickings after, because you're just gonna stay in that same range of colors. And sometimes it is nice to have just a bit of variation of these weirder colors that you might not think of. Because now if I look at the reference, there's some bright, not bright, but pretty obvious yellows, maybe even some blues or greens, which obviously if you overdo on this specific piece, it's gonna look a bit off. But there's probably a nice amount of it that you could add to have a nice variation of color and still look kind of delicious. But good thing in digital, we can always leave that to the separate layer, like another step, and just add it after if we want. So I feel, if you just kind of overlay with a bit of a different colors, it still might look a bit off. It's gonna look a bit more natural if it was painted in from the beginning and was built up as the painting went along. Or it just has to be kind of nicely integrated instead of just slapped on top. If you stick with this one brush approach, you'll see how familiar you get with it after making a few pieces. And it's such a nice thing to know your tool that much better. At many points, I'll take that over having an extensive brush library. But I'm not going to sit here say that custom brushes don't matter and you can paint anything with everything, which is true in a way, but not really. It's I think when people say that brushes don't matter, it's because in the end it is not the brushes that are making or that are doing the painting. It's you, and as long as you know the tools and how to get to a certain result, you can do it despite the brushes. But it's just so incredibly important to be comfortable with the brushes, the tools that you're using, because you don't want it to be a hurdle. You want it to be helping you out. If fighting the tool, the brush that you use is, an extra added complexity to the painting, then it's just not going to end up in a good piece. If you notice there, my way of adding different planes to this was just kind of filling it a shape with a hard brush, and then picking some colors to blend it in with that same brush. So it, even the things like that, little details also come in at different stages. I know that I want the shape, and then I know that I can blend in the colors. At this point, I'm already a bit more confident in using the hard brush. It feels nice. It feels, familiar. I'm sure we've all done our paintings with the hard brush. The important bit as well for me is to not make it feel too digital. And I know once I'm done, I'll have, a dozen other ideas of how I could have approached it and different painting styles I could try out and everything. But that's, I guess, a bit of my nature in these kind of things. A lot of what ifs in my head all the time. We're coming up to the end, to this stage of the texture painting. The next step will be just a bit more further detail and variation in them, as well as some cleanup and adding a bit more interesting textural elements, still with the same brush.